Good morning, everyone. Ready to get started? Okay, good. Our topic today is diet and health. Today we'll discuss the reasons people choose the food they eat. And what I mean is maybe they choose for nutrition, that is, getting the right type of food for good health and growth, or maybe they choose for pleasure, meaning they choose food because it tastes good. But before we go into why people choose the food they do, I'd like to give you some background and briefly explain two basic purposes of food. The first, and I might add the most basic reason that we eat food, is for nourishment. Let me explain this. How our bodies use food for nourishment. When we eat food, for example, have a meal of rice, meat, and vegetables, this food is not in the form that the body can use. It has to be changed by the body. This means changed into smaller molecules of nutrients before they can be taken in. And taken in merely means that the nutrients are absorbed into the blood and carried to the cells throughout the body. Does this process sound familiar to you? The process that I'm talking about is called, of course, digestion. Let's define digestion. Digestion is the process by which food and drink are broken down into their smallest parts, such as vitamins, nutrients, so that the body can use them to build and nourish cells and to provide energy. Okay, that's brief, but a little bit about the first purpose of food, nourishment. Let's look now at the second, and some might say a more powerful reason that we eat food. We eat food because it provides pleasure. You know what I'm talking about, right? To illustrate what I mean by pleasure, think of the good smell of food, the good taste of food, the appealing look of it, and even the feel of food. Pleasure and food have a strong connection for most people. Let me give you a few examples. We eat to celebrate. We eat to reward ourselves or others. You get the picture. My point here is that food and pleasure are closely connected. Let's look at how people choose food for nutrition. Where do people find information about what food is healthy and what food is not healthy? Well, people get this information about food and diet from a variety of sources. Let me give you a typical example. That is, the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA. This is a federal government agency that researches and gives advice and recommendations to people about health and diet issues. You've probably heard about the food pyramid that they publish, right? Well, as you might guess, people don't always listen and take this advice and make their food choices based on these studies. Why is this? Well, nutritional advice can be confusing for a variety of reasons. One reason is that there are a lot of studies with a lot of information about nutrition. Some findings in these studies are quite controversial. People find it hard to make sense of it. There's so much conflicting advice about good nutrition and a lot of marketing, a lot of advertising for food. All this information can tend to confuse people rather than help them, make good choices. I want to look at a perfect example of this point. Potato chips. Look at the potato chip shelf in any store and you're faced with a lot of choices. For example, you might see regular potato chips, low-fat chips, even no-fat chips, chips with salt, chips with low salt, and chips with no salt. There are chips made out of potatoes, sweet potatoes, and even rice. At least 9 choices. Wow, 9 choices, and I'm sure you can find more. How does a person decide what kind of chips to choose? He might read the label on the back of the bag, But even when we read the nutritional labels on the bags, you know, the label that tells us about the fats, salt, and carbohydrates in the food, we're not sure how to balance this nutritional information and our desire for pleasure. So you can easily understand a person saying, I give up. It's just too hard to be healthy. I'm going to just choose the one that tastes the best, and it's just too much for me to understand and decide on. I want to move on and share a really interesting cross-cultural survey that was done by an American psychologist and a French sociologist on the differences between French and American attitudes towards food. Let's look in detail at one example of different attitudes. The French are more likely to choose food on the basis of pleasure. Yep, that's right, pleasure. And here's an interesting fact. The French are, in general, healthier and thinner than Americans. In contrast, they found that Americans have the opinion that certain foods, like fats, for example, are as bad as poison. Poison! And the interesting thing here is that even though they see it as poison, this doesn't stop them from eating the poison, that is the fat. But they eat it with two feelings: pleasure and guilt. Here's an example that helps us understand these attitudes. People in the survey were asked, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase chocolate cake? Listen again to the question. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase chocolate cake? Ready for the answer? The Americans were more likely to say guilt. The French said celebration. What can we learn from this? What explains the fact that the French eat unhealthy food and enjoy it more without so much guilt and stay healthier than Americans? One idea is that the French eat, but they eat with a strict set of rules. Here are some examples of what they mean, a few of the rules that influence their diet. They eat small portions. They don't go back for seconds, that is, more food. They don't snack, meaning eat between meals, and they rarely eat alone. The researchers thought this meant that the French focus not just on what they eat, but on how they eat and how they feel about eating. We might summarize the American approach as this. Americans tend to take a more nutritional point of view when making choices about their diet. That is, they focus on what they eat, and they have less strict social rules that influence their choices. Let's take a look at these habits. So Americans generally don't control portions, eat second helpings, snack between meals. So let's wrap up. You can see that choosing food is a quite complex process. To choose food wisely requires more than just understanding nutrition and digestion. Our choices are influenced by scientific information, pleasure, social habits, and feelings. And we need to understand all of these if we want to answer the question, how do people choose their food?